My name is Laura Beth Bugg. I'm a lecturer in the Sociology of Religion in the Department of Sociology and Social Policy here at the University of Sydney. And I'd like to welcome you to this national series of talks, public forums called One Just World, Think, Talk, Act on Global Poverty and Development. This initiative is sponsored by the Australian government's International Development Agency, AusAid, in partnership with the International Women Development Agency and World Vision Australia. These organizations are joined by a university partner in each city, and in this case, it's the University of Sydney. We're delighted to see you here tonight for Faith and Development, Should They Go Hand in Hand? Now, tonight we're fortunate to have three esteemed guests who are here to share their insights and experience with us and provide a variety of perspectives on the role of faith and religion in development. We're also very pleased to be able to bring you a recording of a recent and exclusive interview with Dr. Catherine Hamlin of the Hamline Fistula Foundation. So Dr. Hamlin discussed her views on this same topic that we're going to be discussing tonight, but more about that shortly. So let's welcome our guests. First, Duncan McLaren is a lecturer on Catholic approaches to humanitarian and development work at the Australian Catholic University, where he's also the coordinator of the university's refugee program on the Thai-Burma border, a program which offers university education to Burmese refugees in camps in Thailand. During the course of his career, Duncan has worked in a number of roles, including that of Director of SCIAF, the Scottish Caritas, Director of International Relations for Caritas Internationalis, stationed at the Vatican, and he was twice elected as Secretary General of Caritas Internationalis. Duncan has degrees in languages, theology, and development studies. He's spoken and written extensively on humanitarian and development topics, refugees, Catholic agency identity, and Catholic social teaching. Please give a warm welcome to Duncan McLaren. Our next guest is Matthew Clark. Matthew's the head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University in Melbourne, where he's also a professor. He's worked with aid agencies in the aid sector for 20 years and has taught development studies at a postgraduate level. Matthew has authored 6 books, including his most recent Development in Religion, Theology, and Practice. He's edited another 8 books, and he's written or presented over 100 book chapters, journal articles, and conference papers. And in case my head of school is here tonight, I hope he isn't getting any ideas about where the bar should be set in terms of production. Matthew's research interests include religion and development, aid effectiveness, the Millennium Development Goals, and disability in developing countries. He also regularly undertakes evaluations of development projects for aid agencies. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Clark. Joel Nagin is Senior Lecturer in International Public Health at the University of Sydney, as well as Research Fellow at the Menzies Center for Health Policy. Joel has managed health and development projects for UN agencies, government departments, and academic institutions. These have been in a number of countries, including Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa. He's also worked closely with a number of faith-based organizations internationally. Joel maintains an ongoing appointment at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where he previously worked on Jeffrey Sachs' Millennium Villages project. He lectures on health systems, project management, and health and development at the University of Sydney. His research focuses on HIV service delivery and health system strengthening in sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific. Please join me in welcoming Joel Nagin. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Hamlin. Earlier this month, I visited Dr. Hamlin at the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital in Ethiopia, where I was able to talk to her about her work and her personal motivations for doing that work. Now, we wanted to have her with us here tonight, but that wasn't possible. So we thought instead that the next best thing was to bring her here by video. The issues that we'll be discussing here tonight are the same ones that I talked with her about, so we hope that once the discussion gets going that you won't notice that she's not here. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Catherine Hamlin.
Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. Doctors Reginald and Katherine Hamlin arrived in 1959 to set up a school for midwives. They encountered a number of women presenting with obstetric fistula, a childbirth injury. The plight of these patients was so tragic that they immersed themselves in service to those suffering from this condition. In 1974, the need became so great that the Hamlins established the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital, where Katherine Hamlin still works to this day.
I and my husband too, we both came from families that had a very big missionary background. And I didn't really become a Christian until my student days when I was working, and I was very affected by a sermon once, and then a reading from the Bible when Jesus commissioned Peter. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus asked him a question 3 times. Peter, do you love me? 3 times. And every time he said, yes, you know I love you. And he said, Jesus said, feed my sheep or feed my lambs. And that really affected me very much. And I remember kneeling down and saying, I think I'd like to go and help you somewhere in the world.
በስመ አብ ወወልድ ወመንፈስ ቅዱስ አሐዱ አምላክ አሜን። ዮሐንስ ወንጌል ምዕራፍ 16 ቁጥር 25 እስከ መጨረሻ ድረስ
5% of all women in the world need some help to get a baby out. Who've either got a small pelvis, the bones are too small, and of course that's when early marriage comes in this country, because the girl gets pregnant before her pelvis is fully developed, or it's badly shaped. So that's often a problem. The obstruction is due to the passage that the baby has to pass through to get out.
The pressure, as a result of this obstruction, leads to the formation of an abnormal opening between the birth canal and adjoining organs. This is what is called a fistula.
She is nearly 15 years old now. Nearly.
The damage is so terrific that the whole bladder has died, because the blood supply has been cut off from the bladder as well as from the vaginal tissue.
If the mother survives, she becomes incontinent, and the constant leaking trickle of body waste makes her smelly and unwanted. She becomes a social outcast.
The difference is now the catheter is in. I'm not leaking any longer. I sleep on a dry bed. This is the difference between the previous time and now, she says.
They've lost a baby, and very often they've lost a husband. He's run away and left them because he can't cope. And so it's a terrible trauma for this little girl. She's now lost everything, and her family love her, but they can't really put her in the house with the other children or the other guests coming in and out because of her offensive smell. And so they'll build a lean-to, perhaps on the house or in a little shed somewhere in the compound, and she'll languish there forever unless she can be cured.
You know, she says she has bright future. She wants to go to school and to get education, and then to get some, salary, and help her family and help her own, herself as well. That's what she is wishing after, provided she is cured, she said.
We say together the Lord's Prayer that he taught us when he was here.
The work is now extended to centres countrywide, and since 1974, the Hamlin Fistula Hospitals have treated over 36,000 women. A midwifery college has also been established. bringing Katherine Hamlin's work full circle.
And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God our Father in heaven and the fellowship of his Holy Spirit be with each one of us, be with our patients, be with our work today. We thank you, Lord, that you're here with us and we can come to you and speak to you at any time. We thank you, Lord, for this. In Jesus' precious name. Amen. Thank you.
Okay, so this evening is going to be an interesting discussion with some people who've spent a lot of time thinking and practicing and writing about the area of religion and development. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you panelists to tell me briefly, in 3 minutes or less, a little bit about your work and what the key issues are. And then what we're going to do is have about 30 minutes of discussion interspersed with some of Dr. Hamlin. And then we're going to have 30 minutes of your questions following that. But first, just to give you a little bit of context, religious institutions, particularly religious NGOs, have a long-standing role in development work, especially since the early 1960s. And of course, there are significant links between secular international development agencies and faith-based institutions. And more recently in the world of development aid, agencies have begun to understand the multidimensional facets of poverty. So not only the economic and physical dimensions, but also the social, cultural, and psychological dimensions. So this has opened up new doors in the debates around the role of religious development organizations and whether or not they in fact address the issue of development in a more holistic way, which is why we thought it would be very interesting to ask, do faith-based organizations do things differently than secular organizations, and how do these characteristics impact performance and behavior as development agencies, and whether one approach is more effective than the other. So I'm going to start at the beginning and ask how they became to be involved with this work. And I asked Dr. Hamlin this question as well, of how she became involved in this work of helping women in a developing country. So let's hear what she had to say first.
We thought, well, why don't we go and do something in a developing country to help? We both had the same idea that we would like to do this. I said, we don't need to do it forever. We don't need to make our lives work there. If we don't like it, we'll come away. So we set off in the wrong sort of motives, I suppose. We didn't want to convert the world or help the world. We wanted to help ourselves. How we really decided to come was we had a little boy of 6, and he was being taken to kindergarten or school. And coming back, Reg thought, I'll just nip in here, and I'm so worried about taking this child to Ethiopia. I knew nothing about it really. And so he sat down in a pub and thought, I'll have a beer and just think about this over this, sitting quietly. There was another man sitting beside him, and he said, you've got something on your mind, mate, haven't you? Reg said, yes, I have. And he said, I'm wondering whether to take my little boy to Ethiopia. Oh, he said, I've just been there. I've been doing a mapping mission. Lovely country, and my little boy went to school there and everything. It's quite all right. You'll love it. So Reg came back and said, we're going now. So that was the end of that. So we set off, and we never regretted it. But I know that God is behind all these things, and I know in my heart many times we've been depressed and thinking, well, we can't manage, we haven't got enough money. And things have happened that have just been miraculous. And I've felt the presence of God in our staff. We've got a wonderful staff who have the same motivation as I have. And I think it's all to do with love. Love, you love your work, you love your patients. And of course it's from God, the love of God for these women. They're very appealing actually, and you can't help loving them. And fortunately we got some very beautiful early ones that really broke our hearts, and we thought we meant to be here.
So clearly for Dr. Hamlin it's a religious motivation, but Duncan, can you tell me, in the beginning, was it a religious motivation for you that brought you into this kind of work?
Not really, in fact, because I was brought up in a very grey Clydeside town near Glasgow, and I escaped in my imagination by having pen pals all over the world because I was so bored there. I hope none of you come from there either. But I love it, of course. I had pen pals all over the world, including in so-called developing countries. We even sent to people who'd suffered from a cyclone in Samoa some of our Scottish cuisine, how they got on with baked beans and deep-fried Mars bars, I don't know. But anyway, but it taught me about injustice in the world and deep-grained poverty. And I looked around me. I come from quite poor working-class family in Scotland, and I saw the connections between the domestic poverty and international poverty. Later, it was certainly my faith that brought me to then study theology and development at Edinburgh University, led by my professor of theology, who was a Church of Scotland minister, and who said that I should really study Catholic social teaching. Because essentially, when we look at people from the developing countries, they derive their primary source of meaning from religious practices. And yet in development work, so often that's just ignored. But as far as religion is concerned, we must remember there's good religion, bad religion, and very bad religion. And the very bad religion is, for my mind, is characterized by those fundamentalists of all creed who go into a humanitarian situation with a bag of food in one hand and a very particular holy book in the other, and then they basically try to bribe vulnerable people. That is very bad religion. Good religion is sharing your humanity, sharing your values, but also not just concentrating on material well-being for the poor, but concentrating also on empowering them and giving them back their dignity and their humanity.
So Matthew, this brings up the question of, sort of the good and the bad of religion and development. So I'll ask you the question of whether or not religion should even be incorporated into the planning of community development interventions in the same way that, for example, gender or the environment are incorporated, other cross-cutting issues. It's quite a contentious issue. Why is this the case?
Well, I think it's the case because of the point that Duncan made, that there's good religion, and very bad religion. There's also good development, and very bad development. And very bad development is when you ignore how people understand their world. And religion is a very important part, as Duncan said, of how people understand their place in the world. They understand the world around them. So if we want to have good development, we need to incorporate that. The fact that religion is excluded largely from development thinking, I think, goes back to the fact that development as we currently understand it is only 60 years old. It came out of World War II and the reconstruction of Europe, but it had a history before that of modernity that came out of the Enlightenment. And religion, as part of modernity, was seen as a very private matter at best. And then as we moved then into development and understanding development, that perspective on religion was kept, that religion was at best a private matter, and at worst it was a bottleneck to development, and we needed to get rid of religion. And that we haven't evolved from that point of view. And so we refuse to understand that 80% of the world's population profess faith, that 80% of the world's population understand their position in the world through that religious lens. And that's why we have suboptimal development outcomes. We don't take that into account, just as we didn't take into account gender or environment. We need to understand fully what motivates people, what people understand as the purpose of their life, to fully understand what we can do to work with them. But because development is part of the modernity process and part of the secular West, we just find it very difficult to talk about. We find it very embarrassing to talk about. We don't want to engage with it. And that's why it's a contentious issue largely.
And Joel, clearly, since you've worked in Africa, Africa is overwhelmingly religious. I mean, what were your motivations for going to work in Africa, for working in the development sector, and how has that played out for you? What are your views on religion and development?
Well, I grew up in Toronto, which does not sound nearly as grey as parts of Scotland, it seems. But my family is from Zimbabwe and South Africa, so I heard these stories and family myths about sub-Saharan Africa growing up, and that is what always inspired me as a young person to want to understand this family story. And then as soon as I spent time in Southern Africa, I just saw there was a lot of work to do, and that was quite a non-religious, but just a personal value expression of wanting to work in that environment, and that has led me for about 7 or 8 years to work in sub-Saharan Africa on health and development programs. And in that time, I mean, the diversity of religious organizations that you see is really pretty amazing. And in a lot of environments where government health services are not able to reach those areas, not able to provide quality services, it's churches and religious NGOs that are providing health services to people who need them in the most far-flung corners of some countries. And they're really driven by outstanding people with strong values to help the poorest peoples in their communities. I've also seen, I guess as Duncan and Matthew both said, the good, bad, and very bad, and I would have said good, bad, and ugly, but I guess very bad will work as well. And so you have situations where, for example, the Vatican is against condom use, and that has a significant impact on HIV prevention programming. But then I've also met and worked with church leaders in rural Kenya who see their constituents dying and who prioritize supporting the poorest and most vulnerable people in their communities over imposed European religious dogma or what some book might say or what some person in Rome might say. And these church leaders give out condoms and encourage people to practice safe sex. And in the same way, I've seen religion used as a justification for female genital mutilation in Muslim parts of northeastern Kenya. And at the same time, I've met imams who strongly argue in those communities that female genital mutilation has no basis in the Quran and should be eliminated. So I just think it's been fascinating for me in my own development experience, meeting people from both sides of this religious, well, I guess from one side of religion, but who profess different beliefs depending on the realities that they face. And I think that diversity is something we need to acknowledge when we're talking about religion and development.
And I think this obviously raises the question of the presence of values in development and how we measure development. And this was one of the questions that I asked Dr. Hamlin about how she understands the issue of development in the Christian tradition. So let's hear what she had to tell me about this in the context of her work. How is it for you to see a woman come in? How do you understand her healing process as a Christian?
Well, I know God has got something to do with it, with healing, but I think the first thing is to show that you love this woman, that she's very special to you. And I can't help loving them. I'm sure God has given me this love for these women. And even when they've got the most terrible injuries and you really have some struggle to examine them, and they're not attractive in that position, and I still love them. And I'm sure that that opens up your heart to these women, and the women open up their hearts to you, and it's a mutual thing. I don't think you have to be a Christian to be sure that this woman's going to be healed. But I certainly believe that God is behind what we're doing, because we've never lacked anything that we've asked God to help us with. We got this land in a miraculous way. We got the money for the hospital in a miraculous way from New Zealand. And, well, I thought it was miraculous.
And I know that prayers are very important to you. We were fortunate enough to meet with you this morning. Do you meet for prayers every morning with your staff?
We usually have quite a big group, and different sisters pray or different sisters read, and it's very exciting, really. I started that because I thought they were frightened to go to the chapel, those little nursing aides. They feel that they really didn't understand all the things that were going on in a more sort of formal thing. So I said, just stand around, we'll read God's word and we'll just pray together. And so it started like that, and they're excited about it, I think.
And the group who was gathered there, the staff, they were Orthodox?
Not all, some of them
Christian
were
and Protestant?
Most of the little girls from the countryside are Orthodox or Muslims, but not always. The Muslims don't always come to the prayers, but if they come, we're very welcoming to them. We have a few Muslims on the staff, and then of course a lot of the sisters belong to Protestant churches.
And has that been difficult at all to?
No, it hasn't, because we know that we may have, the fundamentals are the same. We love God and we believe that God sent his Son into the world to save the world. And the Orthodox Christians think that. They do have a lot of worship of Mary, but I'm not put off by that. If they like to do that, it's quite right. So I don't think anything is very much against what I believe. And I certainly wouldn't say you don't believe correctly. And I believe there are all sorts of people in the world that we never think will become God's children in heaven one day, but they will be there, I'm sure.
So Dr. Hamlin's response there raises the question of religious organizations from a particular tradition working in other faith contexts or working in multi-faith contexts. What are the particular issues around that? Can religious organizations work well in interfaith contexts? Can they bring about, for example, peace with communities in conflict when those conflicts are related to religious issues?
They can. They won't necessarily, though. Sectarian violence is quite dramatic, and there's evidence of that in all parts of the world for a long period of time around in history. But there can be a common understanding, a common language between religions and within religions as well that facilitates some of that peace building. And I think that's the strength. It's not necessarily always going to happen, and it certainly doesn't happen all the time. But there is an opportunity there because of a common language and that common sense of human dignity that can facilitate it. And the Solomon Islands, there's been women there and women in churches were very important to peace building. So there are examples where it's been very important.
In Sri Lanka, for example, after the tsunami in Galle in the south, there were various great problems between the faiths there. The majority were Buddhist, but there were significant minorities of Christians, Hindus and Muslims. And what we did to try and get the community working together was instead of buying goods from one particular trader who would have belonged to one particular faith tradition, we went to a Hindu one, a Muslim one, a Christian one and a Buddhist one, and we made this apparent to the community. And then they began to work together. We worked very closely with Buddhist monks there, for example. And what I disagree with Dr. Hamlin about, I think she's a wonderful woman, is that, to my mind, she's confusing development work by a faith-based organization and missionary work. It is not the task, at least the Catholic view is, it is not the task of Catholic aid and development agencies to missionize, to proselytize. And even the Pope says this in Deus Caritas Est, the God is love, one of his very first encyclical, in fact. And it's the difference between if evangelization is about sharing the good news in terms of witness, that's one thing. But if it's actually about bringing people into your faith tradition, that's missionary work, it's not development work.
And Joel, do you have any thoughts on the issue of proselytizing? I mean, should faith-based organizations be allowed to proselytize if they're actually out there doing the good work?
I've seen organizations that have proselytized, and it's such a shallow... The depth of engagement by people who come to those institutions. If you come to a health center and you have to profess a faith of some kind, it's so shallow anyway. I don't even see that being good missionary work unless you're just trying to tick a box and pat yourself on the back. So it's not good development practice, as Duncan says. It's not good health practice, and I don't actually think, not that I would know, but it's not good religious proselytizing practice. So I really think that has no place. The thing that one of the people interviewed in one of these videos said is the girls want education and salaries and opportunities to grow into active women participating in their communities. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for faith from this experience. They're looking for opportunity. And I think that's where Amartya Sen's development as freedom, development as providing opportunity and choice to live your life to the fullest, is the conception of development that we should be trying to support.
One of the difficulties is, though, that the mission work and development work, whilst they're quite separate, they can look very similar. And it's very difficult sometimes to see the difference between God's work and good works, because it's often the same, depending again on the different organisation involved. They will tackle the same sorts of issues around human poverty and education and health. And again, it's not necessarily, it's very difficult to, and there's a continuum between mission work and development work, and organisations probably move along that continuum at various times. And it's never really quite easy to draw the line and say, well, that's where it's good works, and that's where it's God's work, and there's an overlap there. But because of that overlap exists, that does give religion a bad name in development. And I think that goes back to the first question of why is development excluded, because it's often mixed up with mission work.
And this, of course, has been one of the strengths of religion, is that it does have concern for the poor, the marginalized, and these sorts of things, but then it does get mixed in with the proselytizing. But this is one of the questions that I asked Dr. Hamlin, was about, is poverty a values issue, and do Christians in particular, because she's running a Christian organization, do they have a particular responsibility to help people in poverty? So let's hear what she had to say in answer to that. I mean, do Christians have a particular responsibility to tackle issues of poverty, do you think?
Well, I think so. They should be tackling poverty as well as trying to make people Christians. But poverty is to talk to a poor person that there's going to be a life ahead for you, or you're going to heaven one day. That doesn't help them if they're going to be struggling here in this world for years and years with nobody looking after them, nobody helping them. You have to do both things at once. And do the first things first, get the body going and get them happy with their life and happy, and then accept our Lord, accept Jesus and accept God as the Father of us all. I think we're doing it the wrong way around. If you suddenly go preaching at them when you don't help them in any way, they won't thank you for that, and they won't respond. I wouldn't either. Would you?
So I think for her, we see how closely those issues of, addressing issues of poverty and proselytizing are related, but again, addressing the issues of the body first and then the soul, right? I want to move straight into the next video, which is asking her whether or not she thinks faith-based and secular organizations operate differently, and then I'm going to ask you guys what you think about that as well. So let's see what Dr. Hamlin had to say about that. Do you think, as a Christian organization, that you run and manage things differently than, say, a secular or non-religious organization might be run?
Well, I don't know. I think we can learn a lot from the secular ones. I don't think being a Christian makes our hospital any better than anyone else. A lot of Christian hospitals are very run down because they've got usually so little money. But we've been very fortunate with our wonderful trusts overseas that we've set up to fund this work, and they're all so generous with their support. That has kept us going. And I don't think that, no, not all Christians, of course, in the trusts, but they still love the work. They still love the thought of helping a woman in her greatest hour of need.
So I think one of the issues she raises there is, do they do things differently? And also the issue of non-religious people working for faith-based organizations, as well as, religious people working for secular organizations. Has this been your experience in the field?
I would say that there can be a difference. It is always there, but there can be a difference. I think especially in terms of a long-term commitment. In some of the literature by secular people, they actually stress the role of religious sisters who live with the poor in slums and who share their lives and who are there for 20, 30 years. A bit like Dr Hamlin in Ethiopia, but showing a witness to their faith and being development workers as well. But not proselytizing in the full sense of that word, but leading people to become to the full dignity of their humanity, and that's really quite a different thing. To my mind, it's about making a Muslim a good Muslim, but above all, bringing that person to the fullness of his or her humanity. I think so long-term commitment is one. I think also sometimes there is a different a difference in the way that we approach things. There's less of a business contract with partners, for example. And lastly, I think that there is sometimes a difference in the way we do development. And, you know, in Iran, for example, after the earthquake in Bam, an old Muslim lady came up to one of our Caritas workers and said, "Would you give me a Bible?" And she said, "Well, I can't give you a Bible. The authorities would close us down. It's also not what Caritas does within the Catholic Church. But why do you want one? You're a Muslim." And she said, "Well, I want to see what makes you people treat us with such respect and love, because other NGOs don't. The government certainly doesn't. The Red Crescent doesn't." So at best, there is that kind of a sharing of humanity, not just a giving of skills to the other, and really empowering the other, giving the other person back his or her dignity.
Did you have any thoughts on this, Joel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's a big role for faith-based organizations to play, and there are some things that they are able to do that other organizations might not be able to. And I serve as a board member for Jewish Aid Australia, which is an organization in Australia that works with refugee communities, indigenous communities, and some overseas work as well. And that's about tapping into the Jewish values of Tikkun Olam, which means heal the world, and Tzedakah, which is charity, which are values within the Jewish religion that a lot of members of the community hold, and trying to tap into that to get people involved and get people to understand social justice issues. And it's essentially a social justice organization. And I see that as part of an opportunity and responsibility to work within that community and to express those values. But the fact is there's a number of orthodox tenets of Judaism and of other major religions that, with regard to women's rights and empowerment, that I think are very limiting. And so I would not join an organization that profess those types of beliefs and use them in their development work. So, you know, I think religious organizations have an opportunity, but then they also have a responsibility to realize where the tenets of the religion end and actually can be damaging to development practice. So certainly Jewish Aid Australia does not profess Orthodox Jewish tenets in its development practice, and if it did do so, I wouldn't be part of the organization. And I guess that's the line that Matthew was talking about before, is where do we find that line between good development practice, bad development practice in a religious context.
You've led me beautifully into the question of gender, which is a very important one that I want to get to. So one thing I asked Dr. Hamlin is, you know, the issues of treating women, and are there particular issues around this? So let's hear her views on this, along with what her ideas about responsibilities to people in poverty should be.
I think that we have to do, not only give them our spiritual teaching, but also give them hope for their schooling, and to bring them on as normal people in the world, so that they feel that they're worth something. Yeah. They feel that they're second-class citizens. But if you educate them, they take over the farms, they do everything, and they're fantastically better than the men. The men sit round gossiping under the trees, lazy. If you speak to our little nursing aides, some of them have gone out now from here. We had them all in a home to begin with, and some of them have gone and rented little cottages around, little houses or just rooms, and made a life for themselves away from the hospital even, coming every day to work. So they're enterprising, and they think of things, and they all go to night school, and they're really excited about learning. And so there's so much we can do for women in this country, apart from their fistula injuries. Also that women in very many developing countries are second-class citizens. Their status is not the same as men. And I mentioned this when I was being interviewed by Oprah, that if you were a man and you were leaking urine, something would have been done years and years ago.
And I have to say, I'm no Oprah. Clearly, I think that was the inference there, right? So clearly women not only in developing countries are second-class citizens, but in many religious traditions they're second-class citizens as well, right? So in terms of funding faith-based organizations, participating in religious development, what about the elephant in the room, which is the issue of gender?
I don't think it's an elephant in the room. I think we know that gender is an awfully important part of good development work. We've known it for a number of decades, and it's now become almost normal within development to see the world and see development through that gender lens of making sure that men and women and children in communities are all benefiting appropriately. Certainly religion and religion itself can make things difficult in terms of the place of women in society, but that's through how that religion has been institutionalised largely. The basic sacred texts and the basic teachings are often don't put those barriers around women. That's the institutionalisation of it. Faith-based organisations have an opportunity to be different to the religious institution itself, and faith-based organisations doing development work ought to know about gender. They ought to know about men and women in communities and development affecting them differently, and just because they're faith-based ought not to stop them doing it well. And if the fact that they're faith-based and they're not doing it well is probably more a reflection on them as a development agency more than a link to a religious organisation, I'd suspect.
And Duncan, I want to give you a chance to respond as a Catholic on our panel.
That's right, the talking. Well, actually, empowerment of women is core to Caritas and Catholic agency work. And it's interesting that I remember a project in Kenya. It was a group of Christian women, mixed denominations, but Christian women. And they actually had a course, the empowerment course was actually looking at powerful women in the Bible. And the women cottoned on that if this was in a sacred text, then they could do it in their domestic situation. They could be powerful and stand up to their husbands and so on, which is actually also, to go back to Joel's point about HIV and AIDS, is an extremely important preventive measure, because very often you've got a drunk man coming home demanding sex, and there's not much point in the woman, holding a packet of condoms in front of him. So there are other strategies that have to be used. And a third, in fact, of people living with HIV are cared for in some way by Catholic institutions, we should remember, in a different way. But the teaching of the Church is as it is. But you can actually use resources of the various faith traditions in empowering people. That's my point.
And Joel, I'll let you get in quickly because I'm conscious of the fact that we need to go to the audience for questions. So.
I just think it's the elephant in the room that you mentioned around gender and religion and development. I just think it's worth giving a bit of historical context to the original conception of the Millennium Development Goals, which, as we know, are the 8 goals that we've agreed as a global community in September 2000 in New York around child mortality, maternal mortality, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and so on. And in the original conception of the Millennium Development Goals, there was an extra Millennium Development Goal, which was focused on reproductive health, contraception, family planning. And in the discussions in New York in the lead-up, 3 countries basically lobbied against the inclusion of a reproductive health Millennium Development Goal, which would have galvanized the world community around this. And it was the US, the Vatican, and Iran. And at no other time in world history have those 3 countries or entities agreed on anything. On anything. And yet they were, and this is the elephant in the room, they were able to come together in this interfaith dialogue, so to speak, and agree to limit the choices of women. And so we have a giggle, and it's kind of funny that these 3 groups came together, but the one thing they can agree on amidst all the things in the world is to limit the choices of women and the kind of impact that's had on development practice. So there is an elephant in the room there that we need to be very concerned about. And I don't think we can, I think we've had some positive things expressed here, but I think we need to keep in mind that there is a dangerous element to faith and development, and we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, what I'd like to do now is open it up to you as the audience. So we'll have 30 minutes of questions if you'd like to queue up and start asking, okay?
My name is Narotami. My question's actually for Mr. McLaren. And forgive me if it's a question that you've most likely been asked it before, but it touches on what Mr. Negan was saying just about the public health thing. And you mentioned it yourself, sort of like the condoms in South Africa. Like, it's so confusing for somebody who doesn't have the faith that some people do to hear these big organisations preaching against something which saves lives, like it really does. And so my question is how can the church continue to preach against something that saves so many lives?
Rosemary, you're quite right. It's a very important issue. We thought that Pope Benedict was going to come out with a statement, in fact, saying, and this is a minimalist argument, I agree, that condoms could be used when there was a married couple and one was positive and one was negative, because you would be transmitting death, not life. There has been a lot of lobbying, particularly from missionaries, from Caritas itself, to change that particular policy and that particular teaching, or to nuance it, and it hasn't happened yet. But all I can say is that you must remember that the Catholic Church is not a monolith, that it has that particular teaching, but then you have the pastoral side as well. And that missionaries will look at the pastoral, the compassionate side of reality, rather than go for an ideal all the time, which would then harm people's lives. See what I mean?
Yeah, sort of. I agree, maybe changes are happening and things like that, but it'd be good to see more. But thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Josephine Maguire-Rosier. I guess my question is to anyone who would like to answer it. It's on the interplay of the roles of the Australian government, international aid, and religion and faith with our own government. That's in particular relation to something that I heard. I don't know whether it's true, so please correct me if I'm wrong. That Tony Abbott, when he was previous health minister, actually denied aid funding to NGOs that offered family planning services. So my question is around the role between our government, religious faith, and our international aid programs.
My understanding is that the denial of aid to aid organisations for the use of reproductive health went back to the sale of Telstra and Senator Brian Harradine, and it was linked into that. So it was much earlier than that, actually. But certainly that was a reality, that aid money could not be spent on. I think it was a bit more narrow than just reproductive health. It was actually on around abortions largely, and the services supporting abortions or information around abortions. But that was a reality for a long period of time, and probably only recently has that stopped.
Yeah, that was true in the US as well. It was called the Global Gag Rule, and any organization that talked about abortion or supported abortion or provided that on a list of options, even if that was 0.1% of what they did and the other 99.9% of what they did was fantastic, that organization could not be funded by the US government. And Obama changed that when he came in, and the Labour government changed that about 6 months later, I believe, here. And again, that's religious-based dogma impacting good development practice. And in the Australian context, Matthew's right, it was done to appease one senator. And that's often how policy gets made. And it's up to us and the people in this room to have our voices be heard when situations like that occur.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Guy. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for doing what you do. It's fantastic, whatever you are. With respect, I think the elephant in the room is actually what motivates Christians to do what they do. And along the lines of preach the gospel, heal the sick, is the Great Commission, if you like. Preach the gospel, heal the sick, baptise people. My question is, how can Christians be encouraged, if you like, to continue doing the work that they've been told to do if they've got their legs cut off?
Well, I mean, I think that...
Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah. Fine, yeah. I think that in most traditions, they put anti-poverty work at its centre. Tony Blair, not necessarily a man I admire, but Tony Blair, when he left the premiership of the UK, said that the only reason that the G8 countries reduced debt to developing countries was because of the Jubilee 2000 campaign led by the churches. And there are many other examples of advocacy, which we really haven't talked about, but advocacy campaigns being the voice of the voiceless in the world that are led by people of faith. But there are some denominations which perhaps would put the kind of work we're talking about as on the periphery, even within my own church, the Catholic Church. There are some people who would say it's more important to concentrate on the spiritual rather than what they regard as good works. But in fact, there are three central tenets of the faith, one of which is diakonia, which is serving others, and that's where we find social justice. So it's actually central to not just the Catholic, but to the Christian faith.
If I can just say something about the Jubilee Campaign, because I think that is such an interesting example of churches drawing on the narrative resources within religion. And I mean, with the Jubilee year, which is mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Christian Old Testament, is about the cancellation of debts, right? And so this idea was taken literally, and that poor countries should not have to pay back their debts. And so Christians mobilized around this concept of debt cancellation, which I think is such a powerful idea, right? And it's because you have these narrative resources in the religious tradition, which I find quite amazing. Yeah.
I think may have missed my point, and I don't want to belabor it. I believe as a Christian that people who accept Jesus as their Lord and Saviour will have eternal life. People therefore need to have their needs met, their debts forgiven, be freed from the prison, their fistulas fixed, but they also need to be introduced to something which is actually far more eternal, and that's what drives me as a Christian. And I just wondered the reaction. I mean, that's one of the driving forces, to help people where they are and to give them, an encouragement to go further than that. And that's to my mind is a true missionary work. But I really endorse anything that helps. And that's what I'm asking a response for, because I think if I can only help the person now and not allowed to help them for the rest of eternity, I've only done half the job.
And I think that's probably a question for a whole other forum, but thank you for that. Yes.
I've got a question actually about employment. Certainly in Australia, when you look at job ads for our religious NGOs, they very often have listed as an essential criteria a willingness to work within the values of, and then insert religion here. So I guess my question is, to all of you, what's your opinion on that? And is that a real issue in terms of shaping who gets employed and therefore how work is carried out?
I'll share you with my experience. I worked for World Vision and was employed by World Vision in, I think, about 1993 or 94. And I started working in the call centre for the 40-hour famine. And I'd only just completed a master's degree in development, so I was all very excited. And that part of the organisation at that time, most people worked there because it was a Christian organisation first and a development agency second. In the international programming side of things, where I moved to after a couple of years, the majority of people at that time worked in that section because it was a development agency first and a Christian organisation second. So within the organisation there were different cultures and different senses of what it was. You're not the only Catholic spokesperson up here, Duncan. I was as well, but I was told at that point that I wasn't really a Christian because I was Catholic. But that was a long number of years ago, and the organisation has changed and shifted since then. But I think it's important, whether you're working for World Vision or Oxfam or whichever tier or whatever it might be, that you actually do feel comfortable working within the understanding of development within that organisation, whether it's Christian or not Christian. I think that's probably appropriate. Whether people do get employed or not on that basis, I think it's probably less now than it might have been a decade or 2 decades ago. But I'm not sure that would... You'd have to ask the actual people currently working in different organisations for their experiences, I think.
25 years ago, when I got involved in this kind of work, we were very motivated by the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, by a liberation theology, which you're not supposed to mention nowadays. But nowadays, we have a far greater mix of people, far greater mix of people coming into, say, the Caritas network. They will not necessarily, the vast majority, not the vast majority, but the majority would not be Catholic, but they would like the values of the agency. And it's amazing how they sometimes defend the values of the agency more than the lapsed Catholics that might be in an organisation. And I just came back from Sri Lanka on Sunday there, and a colleague from Caritas Australia is a very good Buddhist. But he was there defending Catholic, not defending, but promulgating Catholic social teaching as a way of understanding what good development practice was about in all faith communities. And I've been involved with Muslim and Buddhist communities in showing them the matrix of Catholic social teaching and how that can be applied to indicators for good development practice. And they say, particularly the Muslims, say, we've got the same values in the Quran. So there has to be more of this kind of dialogue from the tools of the various faiths, because of course the values are essentially the same, and we've just a different way of talking about them.
Just very quickly, I was working with Oxfam recently in the Melbourne headquarters, and as I was working with a couple of people, I looked around and everybody was walking around with their little bag of fair trade coffee. And if you didn't have your fair trade coffee, you weren't going to be able to work at Oxfam. So even Oxfam has its culture, and that should be in the ad, that you will only drink fair trade coffee, and if you don't feel comfortable doing that, don't work for Oxfam. So there's different cultures in different organisations.
Yes.
Oh, hi everyone. My name's Jennifer. I just came back from Cambodia, and I was just there for a very short time, and I visited an NGO it's a very small NGO. It was just run by one person mainly. They work with disabled children, and for reasons of the long-term sustainability of the NGO, they've decided to join with the Maris Brothers School that's just down the road and does very similar work. And now the little NGO is having problems getting funding from donors in the West because they've now suddenly joined with a religious organisation. And I'd wondered if you'd come across similar problems where donors had only ever donated to secular organisations and had then just, oh, you're now religious, oh no, we can't donate to you anymore, even though the actual work hadn't changed?
Well, I think it works both ways. It's opened up probably a whole new group of potential donors for that NGO from religious communities and from other people who share the values. It maybe has closed off some doors from some potential funders as well. But I guess as Matthew and Duncan were both saying, you have to end up sharing the values of both the organizations you fund and the organizations you work for. And that isn't just about religious values, but also social justice values and so on. So this organization that you're talking about is going to have to make an effort to try and link in with organizations that share its values or find a better way of expressing its values despite its partnership with this faith-based organization. So it is a reality, but I don't see it as closing doors. It's also opening a whole bunch of others.
I think particularly in Europe, in fact, with European Union funding, there was a huge prejudice against faith-based organizations, and if I may say so, particularly the Catholic ones, for the reasons that we were talking about earlier, and now it's gradually changing as debates like this become more common throughout the world, and they see the sense of that there is a very strong role for religion in development, understanding religion in development, and that faith-based organizations, for the most part, do not mix proselytization and good development or humanitarian work, But there seems to be a difference between what's happening in Europe, lessening now, and what's happening in other, particularly the US and Australia in the past.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name's Nalini. I've got a couple of questions. The first one relates back to the lady who spoke before me in some way. pardon me, I probably don't know all the details, but it has to do recently with World Vision. A couple of ex-employees of World Vision tried to appeal against a decision to disemploy them, I suppose, to sack them based on them not, I'm not sure what it was, whether they weren't attending the morning prayers or whatever was requested of them. And they tried to go, I think the case was brought against them, and they lost, and they tried to go to appeals, and the appeals court refused to see it. Now, I'm looking at it from the perspective of, because my understanding of the judgment was that World Vision was deemed to be a Christian organisation and therefore wasn't subject to religious discrimination laws and can use religion to hire and fire. Now, I'm looking at it from the perspective of people that support an organisation like that, and how disturbing it might be when they realise that that's the sort of employment practice that they uphold, and how that can impact. And the question then is that if this is true, is it okay for World Vision to be proud of what they've done, and for the spokesperson to say that it upholds their right to employ people as they choose or to fire them as they choose? And shouldn't an organisation grow like people do? And shouldn't, if it indeed is a Christian organisation, shouldn't it change its practices in how it treats people?
Aware of that case. I've not heard about it at all. In the larger question, it identifies itself as a Christian organisation. Whether there's value in only employing Christians or not, I expect there's great value in employing the whole range of people from different faith traditions and those who don't have any faith, who don't profess a faith at all, because these aid agencies are very professional. They've got a huge responsibility. They're actually intervening in people's lives who are at great risk and who are vulnerable. So you do need to employ people that are very professional and are very good at what you're doing. And so I would think that all agencies, whether it's Oxfam or World Vision or TIER or whatever it might be, would be seeking the best people, but at the same time the best people that can work within a particular organisational culture, and that's probably the key.
World Vision gets its funding from you and me. So it's up to us. I don't think it has to go to the court for this decision to come down. It's also the court of public opinion, and you end up deciding to give to organizations and support organizations that share your values. So if that is of concern to you, then you as an individual might not support World Vision. And there's lots of other organizations that are less religious that you as an individual might choose to support. And one of the things I find in Jewish Aid Australia, for example, that I find a bit strange is, for example, if there's a disaster and the community wants to respond, the Jewish community wants to respond, they could just give their money to CARE, for example. But the Jewish community wants to be seen to be responding, and people want to give to a Jewish organization that's responding to an earthquake or a cyclone or whatever it happens to be. So what we end up doing is we set up a fundraising cycle, I guess, and raise money, and then we donate the money from Jewish Aid Australia to CARE, because CARE is the one that delivers the aid. And so all it is there's a picture of the CEO of Jewish Aid Australia with one of those large novelty checks shaking a hand. But we're looking at good development practice. And so we want organizations that have the feet on the ground, that share our values, to actually do the development work, but members of our community want to give to the Jewish community. So we found a way to bring that together. And there's space for these various different perspectives and groups and beliefs. And I think we've actually found a way to allow the community to do what it wants to do and support a Jewish organization, but also to profess good development practice by supporting an organization like CARE.
It would be wonderful, however, if Jewish Aid gave that big check to Caritas.
There you go.
Maybe.
So we just have time for 2 more questions. So,
my name's Jan. Is there much independent, objective research measuring the effectiveness in particular areas? You'd have to take just a limited area of the effectiveness of faith-based organisations versus particularly non-faith based organisations? And if so, how do you measure the effectiveness and what does it show?
I believe there actually is. I don't think there's an evidence base yet for determining what the value add is of faith-based or not faith-based. Certainly we can assess what good aid is, but I don't think we've got to that next level of developing an evidence base to say that faith-based organisations are better. I suspect that if we were to do that, we would find that it wouldn't be necessarily better at everything, that might have strengths in certain areas but weaknesses in others. But I'm hopeful that we can develop that sort of evidence base, and I think it's really important because it goes back to the fact that this is the reality of development, that there are certain agencies that come from a certain motivation and a certain religious background, and there are others that don't, and we need to understand who these organisations are and what they do differently and what they do better, and what can they learn from one another. So I think that's an area that we haven't studied, that we don't know much about, that we ought to. And it probably just reflects that NGOs 20 or 30 years ago used to say how good they were at development, and that was really untested. And we didn't really know that NGOs were any good or not, but they proclaimed that they were much better at development than the World Bank and other things. And slowly we began to find an evidence base that certainly NGOs could access communities in particular ways, and they had strengths here, but of course they had weaknesses. And I think now the next step is to look at the range of NGOs that include FBOs, faith-based organisations, to do something similar there.
And this will need to be our last question.
Hi, my name's Tim, and you can all fight over this one. I'm not sure who can answer it. But my understanding is that lots of aid and development happens where, we give money to an organisation in Australia or a religious, the arm of a religious organisation, and they then have a relationship with individual development projects, often small projects overseas that are happening. I'm sure not all of it happens that way, but lots of it, or some of it does. So my question is, how can we help a TIR, a Oxfam, or whoever, whatever that body is, a Caritas perhaps, to make sure that the organisations they're supporting practice good religion, not bad religion?
Well, we wouldn't support an organisation that, it depends what you mean by religion. If they're carrying out development work or humanitarian work, then that's what we would support. That is our particular function within the church. There are other agencies to do mission work and educational work and so on. Could you explain a little bit, Tim, what you mean by religion? Yeah.
Well, I guess perhaps, we've talked about that continuum between, where some Christian and I'm sure other religions, for some people it's proselytization with the veneer of development, and for others it's perhaps the other way around, development in the name of the religion. And there's a broad spectrum in between. How do we know, or how does this organisation know which one they're supporting? And more, I guess, to the point, how can they help that organisation to ensure that they do good development and not get sucked into doing the
religious
the lesson?
Yeah. Well, all the major NGOs, whether religious-based or secular-based, are members of ACFID, the Australian Council for International Development, and they actually have a code of conduct where it says, if you proselytise, you're out, And that's an important element in getting funds, for example, from AusAid, and that is reflected in most countries of the world.
It's up to all of us if we're going to give to an organization to do research on that organization. Look at their website, give them a call, try and find something that they've written, a report about their last project, and try and discern from the language that they use and the description of their activities if their values mesh with you. And this isn't just a religious, non-religious, it's secular organizations. Do they talk about social justice in a way that resonates with you, or do they talk about gender in a way that resonates with you? And I think the quality of discussion around development in general in Australia really needs to improve, and I think these types of forums is a good start to it. But we're not passive givers to whatever NGO or whatever project. We have to be very active, and we need to think about it, we need to discuss it with friends and colleagues, and that's going to make all development practice in Australia of a higher quality, religious or non-religious.
So as a closing comment, Duncan, what is the key thing that you'd like people to take away from this forum tonight?
That development is a bit like religion. It's not necessarily about practices, but about life, and that development is holistic. It covers the whole of life, not just economic growth, because that's what you'll hear from many governments and the World Bank and so on. It's a concentration of the human person as a consumer, the human person as an economic counter. We're more than that, and that is what real, authentic development is. It's a development in a holistic way, covering all aspects of what it is to be human. And I think that religious-based organisations have a great role to play in elaborating that concept. That's what I hope you take away with you.
Matthew?
It's very similar to Duncan in that if we're looking to work in a holistic way with communities and individuals, we need to be prepared to accept that they have religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs affect how they understand their place in the world and the world at large. And if we want to be effective, we need to engage in that in a very authentic way, not just pay it lip service, but to actually genuinely want to understand what their religious beliefs are, what their worldview is, because that's the only way we're going to actually do effective development that's going to be sustained into the longer term.
And Joel?
Yeah, good development practice is about listening. I think in anything that we do in Australia or overseas, the first few weeks, months, we should be listening, talking, understanding values. And if those values include religion or don't include religion or include this or that, we have to use that as a starting point for our engagement. And if we do more listening and less dictating, I think that's probably a good thing for our community in general, both here and overseas.
And here's a closing comment from Dr. Hamlin.
What keeps you going, Dr. Hamlin?
I don't know. I just love being here. And I've got a lovely garden. And I love gardening. And I've got friends. And I've got a good staff. And I'll probably be dead in a few years, but it doesn't matter. I might not last a year even. But I'm not afraid to die. I know that I'm in God's hands. And I know that I don't think that I've done anything wonderful. I've enjoyed my life here. And it's not been a hardship. God's put me here. I don't boast about that. I just feel that my life in Australia might not have been anything like as happy as it's been here. I know that I love being here, and I've been provided with everything I need. And I know that I must be God behind it. Must be.
So this has been the 41st forum in a national series looking at key development issues affecting us as members of a global community. One Just World is about two things. It's about giving you an opportunity to hear expert views on world poverty and development, but it also asks you to think about your role and how to help build a more just and equitable future. So on behalf of One Just World, I want to say thank you to our guests, Duncan McLaren, Matthew Clark, Joel Nagin, as well as a special thank you to Katherine Hamlin and the patients and the staff at the Addis Ababa Fistula Hospital for working with us on this interview and for granting us access to film on the grounds of the hospital and to interview staff and patients. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you and good night.